please. All right, 3, 2. Hello, welcome everybody. We're here to present on our community profile project for Social Work 509. And we are going to talk today about the incarcerated population in Wayne County, Michigan. So our team presenting today is me, myself, Yannick, and
I'm Blair.
And we work together all semester to get this information for you guys. So our population that we studied is the incarcerated population in Wayne County, adults only. We did not want to take into account juveniles because they have a separate system and laws for them. The general incarceration rate is about 1,000 per 100,000 residents in the county. And the total population in prisons is about 13,000. The total population in jails is about 1,700. Now, in terms of facilities in the county, there are 11 jails and 2 juvenile detention centers. There's only one prison, which is Detroit Detention Center, and we'll talk about this more at length a little bit later. And there was Detroit Reentry Center, but it actually closed this year, so we didn't take it into account in this project. Wayne County actually has the most jails and prisons per square mile out of the 83 counties in the state. So it's pretty densely populated with these facilities. In terms of data for the general population of Wayne County from the census, the county has about 1.8 million people, which is almost a fifth of the state's population. The county is about 0.75% of adults. And the median household income is $47,000, and then per head it's about $27,000 a year. The poverty rate is about 20% in the county, and about 3/4 of households have internet access. So these 2 points are definitely going to be important in terms of talking about incarceration and the reasons why it happens. The racial breakdown of the county overall is about 50% white, non-Hispanic, and 30% African-American. But it's important to note that almost 3/4 of the entire county's Black population resides in Detroit, so it's pretty concentrated in that area. And the county is also 6.1 Hispanic, with a large concentration in Southwest Detroit as well. The racial makeup of prisons in the county it's overwhelmingly made up of Black people. So 10,000 out of the about 12,000 people in prison in Wayne County are Black. And you can see the numbers there.
So the difference between prisons and jails is essentially that prisons are for people who are serving longer term sentences of 2 years or more, and jails are for people who are serving shorter term sentences of 2 years or less. And so this is kind of just some of the data on the social makeup of jails. The total jail admissions is 28,000 people, but the total actual population of people who are in jails and staying there is about 1,700, as mentioned before. And again, still the overwhelming majority of that is Black people, which is making up 1,200 of that 1,700 in jail. And then most of the people that are in jail are there for pretrial. They're being held for pretrial, and a lot of those people are being held and they're waiting to go to state jail. So they're being sentenced to state jail and they're waiting to go there. And that's making up about 1,400 of that 1,700 people. And this is just a little bit about the geographic location. So this is Wayne County Jail. This is the jail that's holding most of the people in Wayne County. And this is the area. It's just kind of looking really destitute. It's not a lot of businesses, even though it is downtown Detroit. And so if you just kind of go over like a block or two, you start to see a little bit more of a population. You start to see casinos, hotels, there's bars and clubs. And then a major note is that it's a lot of highways. So there's a lot of like air pollution and emissions coming into the area as well.
So we also wanted to talk about accessibility to these facilities. So Detroit Detention Center and Wayne County Jail are 2 of the biggest facilities that we focused on, that most people who are arrested in the area are processed through. So there are actually two train stops near Detroit Detention Center. So it's fairly accessible actually in the city to reach it. It may take a little while, but it is definitely very feasible. And then Wayne County Jail is actually, as Blair mentioned, pretty much right in downtown. You can see it's right near the stadiums, the Opera House, the river. And so you could walk there from downtown. But it's also important to note that if you live in the west side of the county, like the far end towards Ann Arbor, in towns like Belleville or maybe Canton, there is no public transit accessibility to this jail. So it would be hard to visit if you did not have your own transportation. Or if you got out and you were trying to make it back home, you would have to figure out another way.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the incarceration labor and education opportunities. They are offering education opportunity for people who are typically serving longer sentences, and that's looking like special and remedial education for people to complete their GED certification. They noted that there are career and technical educational programs that include horticulture, building maintenance, trades, and computer literacy, but there's definitely a stark difference between which facilities are offering that and which aren't. And as far as like work opportunities, they allow inmates to volunteer to help staff and provide prisoners with religious and other life enrichment programs. The major enterprises that are receiving money from the jail system are the commissary and the call and mail system, which all kind of go hand in hand. Essentially, Continental distributors, the Canteen Correctional Services, they are the people that's administering the snacks, food, hygiene products, clothing, and phone calls to the inmates. They're servicing them 4 days a week, and all the profits are going to operations that's used to fund programs for the inmates, but it's very much so important to note that a lot of these programs are not listed. These programs, they're not saying what percentage of funding is going to which programs or actually what programs they're funding at all. Deposits can be made by Division 1 or Division 2, or you can do it over the phone. And phone calls are just your typical collect calls that you're going to receive to your phone. And they're considered a privilege. So access differs for each inmate depending on their security level as well as their behavior in the facility. This is a fact sheet from the Detroit Justice Center. Detroit Justice Center is an organization that's doing a lot of work that's headed towards decarceration versus providing services to people who are incarcerated. So they're just listing off some facts that include how many beds are available in each facility. They're also noting how many people are in jail. Is 62% that's being held for pretrial and haven't actually been sentenced yet. 70% of those people are Black, even though there's only 39% of Black people in Wayne County in general. And they also, something big to note is that the person is more likely to experience physical or sexual assault within their first 3 nights in jail. So the risk factor for a lot of people goes up as soon as they're admitted into a jail or a prison.
So we actually had the opportunity to sit down and talk with a Detroit police officer and hear about his experience in the last couple of years as an officer, especially during the pandemic. And some of the things we learned from this conversation are that arrests are very, very common. So he makes an arrest like per shift, pretty much, sometimes more. And he's in court like once every 2 weeks, even more often sometimes for these cases of the arrests. He also said that the overwhelming majority of the arrests that he makes stem from domestic violence calls. So the most calls come from domestic violence and the most arrests. And the arrests come because if somebody calls about domestic violence dispute and the police officers show up on scene and the victim reports that the suspect touched them or made physical contact with them, then by law they have to make an arrest of the suspect. And he also asserted that these are generally the most dangerous calls for police officers as well. If an arrest is made and the detainee expresses suicidality or suicidal thoughts, they must be taken to a local hospital to obtain a mental health clearance before being able to be put in the jail. And he also said, to his knowledge, there's not a stark difference amongst police departments across the county as well. In terms of COVID, in his experience working during the pandemic, all people who are arrested must wear face masks and screens while being arrested. There are temperature checks for all police officers and detainees when they arrive to detention facilities. And prisoners must wear masks everywhere except in their cell. The biggest impacts come from inmates having to be spread out and to have their own cell due to the pandemic. And when they're first taken to jail, they're actually given the opportunity to get the COVID vaccine if they so choose, which is really surprising and also really good. When COVID first hit, also a big difference is that police officers were no longer allowed to make arrests for most misdemeanor crimes because the jails have been so full, especially with the spatial issues caused by COVID. So unless it was domestic violence or shoplifting, police officers couldn't arrest people for like parking, backed up parking tickets, even different kinds of speeding. So that kind of changed the law of the landscape. Also, a big difference to note is that all court and judge meetings are now virtual for misdemeanor. So they have those on Zoom, which makes the whole system actually more efficient. In terms of his experience in race relations, Officer Hollis is a Black man, and he grew up in the city of Detroit. And he said that the racial demographic of the police department is very representative of the demographic of the community they serve. So it's mostly Black and Middle Eastern people. And he also said it's pretty consistent throughout the city. So like, for example, in Southwest Detroit, most of the officers in those precincts are of Latin origin, which he said works very well in terms of relations with the community. He said that racially charged incidents with the police are very sparse and isolated, to his knowledge and experience in the field, and that he personally does not see racial disparities in his experience on the job. And also that since the murder of George Floyd and the video surfacing in the summer of 2020, his supervisors in his commandment now have implemented a duty to intervene, so that if he or anybody else sees another officer doing something that goes against their training, or is morally wrong or goes against their code, they have a duty to intervene and stop them, or else they will also get in equal trouble. So it's interesting to learn how that is changing and evolving. He also noted that recidivism is extremely high in the area in which he polices, especially amongst young Black males. So in terms of his personal views on the system as a police officer, he said that now that weed or marijuana is legalized in the state of Michigan, people who are serving sentences for previous marijuana related charges should be released, because there's a lot of overcrowding in the prisons and jails. And so if those people were to be able to release, it would leave more space for people who are actively committing crimes now that could be violent crimes to be put in the system. In his opinion, the system is really easy on people, and it's very common for him to arrest somebody and then see them back on the street the next day, back in the community. And he also said that he wasn't aware of any services offered in the jails and prisons currently. But he said the most crucial thing, if he could implement any new system, or if there were be something to be focused on within the prisons, would be job assistance. And he said that if people were released with a job, it would significantly reduce recidivism, because a lot of people feel like they commit crimes because they have no other choice.
So that just kind of led us back into more research about services that are being offered in jails. So on this slide are 2 prisons that were listed in Detroit, but they are now listed as closed. And they all listed a bunch of different programs that they had offered, including like educational programs, GED certification, and then like residential substance abuse, and just a lot of different programs to combat substance use and help keep people on track and get them ready for re-entry into the community.
It's important to note that these are now closed, and another emphasis on that.
Now the only prison that's listed is the Detroit Detention Center, and it lists no services. Jail Division 1, which is a jail in Detroit, is listed as housing men and women who are clinically assessed with needing residential mental health services or psychotropic medications. Jail Division 2 and Jail Division 3 don't list any services at all. And these are just typical city jails that are in Wayne County, where like essentially you will get arrested and then you would get transported down to Wayne County Jail. So these are just city jails where like your first point of contact with arrest outside of Detroit.
And they have no services listed as well.
The impact of COVID was very stark. A lot of judges were ordering the release of a lot of people, 384 people. This was back in June since the pandemic started. As mentioned from the key informant, a lot of law enforcement reduced the number of arrests that they were initiating throughout the city for a lot of different low-level crimes. And there was no specific regulation for people to have to be mandated to receive the vaccine. But again, they were offered vaccine upon arrest, and detainees had free liberty to accept or decline the vaccine.
It's also interesting to note that the correctional staff as well is not required to be vaccinated. And so they go on outside of the prisons to their normal life outside of work, and then they can come back in and potentially infect people who cannot leave that space.
And so these are just some testimonies that we found. It's not a lot of contact with people who are in jails, and a lot of people who work at jails are not very receptive of contacting people as well, like giving information. But these were some Google reviews that we found to be very stark. And it just really spoke to the condition of the jails, where people were talking about not being able to have access to basic needs for hygiene, or even basic levels of food. This one on the left talked about 2 pregnant women who were not allotted enough food within 3 days that they had been there, and no food, not enough water. So it just really speaks to like the stark condition of like the Wayne County jails and what they look like and how they're very much so disservicing a lot of people.
So now we're going to compare Wayne County to the overall state of Michigan. And looking at the overall incarceration rate, it's almost double in Wayne County than it is for the rest of the state, which is very eye-popping. The Black incarceration rate is actually pretty comparable amongst the state and the county, and so is the white incarceration rate. So the overall incarceration rate is just much higher. Female incarceration rate is pretty comparable as well. But the male incarceration rate is much higher in Wayne County. Again, almost double in that case as well. So there's definitely something to be noted here in terms of incarceration in Wayne County being an epidemic, especially given that, as we mentioned before, it has the highest concentration of incarceration facilities and detention facilities of any county in the state.
So as far as next steps, the Wayne County Commission has announced a new criminal justice project currently being built that includes 3 key developments. And so that's a new criminal justice complex, new mixed use of the failed Gratiot jail site, and the development of the former American Motors headquarters, which was transferred to the city of Detroit by Wayne County in exchange for a new criminal justice site center. The project is very expensive, which will cost approximately $533 million. And the county commission has dedicated $380 million to fund that, which is like more than half of what the project is going to cost. And so we're here to present and ask that there be more services dedicated to the actual jails that are already established, instead of completely doling out $380 million to this new project.
Did I skip one? Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
There we go. So just to wrap things up, our biggest takeaway from doing this profile is that the jails are too crowded. There's too many people. The incarceration rate in the county is way too high. There are too many people in jails. The pandemic has definitely exacerbated this issue because people having to spread out. People are still locked up for marijuana convictions despite legalization now, which means they're still holding up spaces in jail for people who are committing new crimes that are currently illegal. And there's also clear racial disparities in the incarceration rate. So Black people, the Black incarceration rate is almost 7 times higher than that of white counterparts, and is also comparable to in a similar rate to other racial demographics. And as we saw from the key informant, there's high recidivism, especially amongst the Black community, probably because of the cyclical nature of the system. So some potential solutions we've come up with are to increase programs in prison to reduce recidivism. As we've seen, a lot of the programs have kind of ended or closed for a variety of reasons. And so increasing them will allow people to be able to make a life for themselves outside of prison once they leave and not turn back to committing crime. And then social programs to prevent domestic violence. So having different organizations really making that a huge focus or a citywide effort, at least in Detroit, to really hone down on domestic violence, if that is the largest source of arrests and calls in the city. And also policy towards lowering poverty rates. As the key informant mentioned as well, a lot of people turn to crime because of poverty and feel like they have no other choice. So instead of just reinvesting in more prisons to build more prison space, we want the city and the county to take the approach of investing in its people so that they're not constantly in the cycle of the system. So thank you guys for taking the time. These were just our references for each slide, and we're open to any questions. Thank you so much.